Hi, I'm Dan Buttery, President and CEO, War Memorial Center here in beautiful Milwaukee, right on the lakefront of Milwaukee's Michigan, Lake Michigan. And it's an honor today to be joined by General David Petraeus, U.S. Army retired partner, KKR and chair. We're marking the 20th anniversary of Armed Forces, United States and allies going in to Iraq, which we know affectionately as Operation Iraqi Freedom. And we're reflecting on those 20 years of service since, somewhat of a look back and a look forward. General Petraeus, it's an absolute honor to have you with us today. And thank you for taking time to reflect on the past 2 decades of our most notable men and women who serve in harm's way for this beautiful nation of the United States.
Thanks very much, Dan. It's great to be with you. Thanks for your own service in the time that we were all privileged to serve with America's new greatest generation, those who more than any other served in the wars of the post 9/11 period, and all of whom were volunteers.
So you operate at the strategic level, and we always should be lessons learned as we look forward, looking back at whether we're doing a convoy from Baghdad to Balad, or rethinking how we should be training our men and women of today's armed services based on our lessons learned, mistakes, things to retain, and things to improve. Looking back, kind of a big idea, and this is something I know you often refer to, getting the big ideas right. What are some of the tenets that we've learned over the past 20 years with both Iraq, and we could even probably roll Afghanistan into this, and what have we done to improve our look forward from what we've just experienced over the last 2 decades?
Well, of course, a lot of the lessons that we learned were specific to the conduct of comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaigns, which is what we were ultimately engaged in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, at least once the initial invasions of each of those countries was complete. And frankly, it took us longer than it should have to get all of the elements of this right, to have an actual doctrine. You'll recall that we finally drafted that and published it in 2006. In fact, when I was privileged to be back in the States for the 3-year tour that I had here, having already had 2- and 3-star tours in Iraq, and before the 4-star tour in Iraq as the commander of the SIRS there, and then before Central Command in Afghanistan as well. We also had to overhaul every aspect of the so-called road to deployment, how we prepared our soldiers, our units, our leaders, the exercise that we conducted at the National Training Center, for example, the mission readiness exercise that was conducted prior to deployment, all the other activities along that road to deployment that usually began with a seminar that was still on combat in cities until late 2005, when we transitioned it to a seminar on counterinsurgency conducted by the Battle Command Training Program that was under the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth when I was privileged to command there. We also had to overhaul every aspect of leader development training for our commissioned, non-commissioned, and warrant officers to include a fair amount of counterinsurgency doctrine and warfare and so forth, related subjects. Now, again, this is all very specific to that moment in time, to be sure, and rightly, our focus now is shifting back much more to major combat operations with a near peer or peer competitor. That's appropriate, but it's also very important that we don't lose the lessons that we learned in this period or relearned that we'd consigned to history after Vietnam, for example, because there still are lots of activities out there that require essentially a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. And therefore, we need to retain that knowledge. Now, we may do it differently now. We may do it in terms of advice and assist and enabling rather than doing it ourselves on the front lines. And we have different force structure for that wisely, the advise and assist brigades in the U.S. Army, at least 5 of those, I believe, in the active Army, and I believe 1 other in the reserve component. So again, I think we have captured a lot of this. But it took us too long, frankly, both in Iraq and even longer in Afghanistan. I've noted often that it took us literally 9 years to get just the inputs right in Afghanistan. In other words, just the overarching strategy. What should this be? And again, the answer had to be a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, given what it was that we faced. The numbers that we needed, we just about got what we needed and what my predecessor there, General McChrystal, requested. The right organizational architecture, the right leaders, again, the right preparation of our forces, of our materiel, of our organizations, and so forth. All of this, again, it took us 9 years just again to get the inputs right, much less to start achieving outputs. So there were a lot of hard lessons along the way, and a lot in a number of different discrete areas, whether it was literally the conduct of clear, hold, and build operations, with the hold being the emphasis there, not just clear and hand off or clear and walk away. These kinds of lessons, again, very, very important. We learned some very hard ones early on in Iraq as well, when the decision was made to fire the Iraqi military without telling them what their future was. 5 long weeks of increasingly dangerous riots that I'm sure you'll recall, having been part of that period. And then also, of course, during that period, the de-Baathification decision without an agreed reconciliation process. And both of these decisions created literally hundreds of thousands in aggregate of Iraqis whose stake in the new Iraq was to oppose it rather than to support it. Their incentive literally was, again, to fight the new Iraq, not to support it. And that's a big mistake. You may recall that the 101st Airborne Division command post and every one of my successive command posts after that always had a sign on the wall that asked the question, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And if the answer to that was no, in other words, it'll create more bad guys than you take off the street, then you're supposed to go sit under a tree until that thought passes. The same is true of policies such as the 2 that I just described. And there were many other challenges. We never should have tried to oversee the first 18 months or so with a pickup team of individuals that rotated about every 3 months or so, the Coalition Provisional Authority. We should have just established an embassy right off the bat. Always use existing structures, institutions, funding lines, et cetera, et cetera. Don't create one-offs, especially not when you're in the middle of combat. So again, a lot of tough lessons along the way. Those who experience them, I think, have these indelibly imprinted on their mind, but I'm hopeful that these will be still relevant, or at least resonant and obvious, to those who still engage in these kinds of endeavors, even as we rightly prepare for a much more robust major combat operation campaign rather than a counterinsurgency campaign. But keep in mind that where we are actually engaged in combat operations now, certainly not on the front lines necessarily, except with some of our special mission units that are conducting counterterrorism operations, we are largely doing it. It's termed by, with, and through. I think a more descriptive term is advise, assist, and enable, as well as train and equip. And we're still doing that in Iraq. We're still in Syria doing that. We're in Somalia doing that. We're doing that to varying degrees in other locations in Africa. Still some modest, very modest residual in Latin America and so forth. So these activities are still there. They're missions that we still have to engage in. And we need to be sure that we don't consign all of this to the ash heap of history, as was done in the wake of Vietnam.
You really were known for winning the hearts and minds statement when I was in country. And I remember reading that and thinking, this is exactly spot on, because now, granted, I was working with Shia, which were much more friendly at the time than the Sunni. This is just slightly prior, before the Muqtada al-Sadr's, kind of flared up. But within the engineer assets, we definitely took that to heart. And we worked very closely with sheikhs. I sometimes wonder if they're still with us. I hope they are. I haven't been back since I was there in OIF-1. but you nailed it with that assessment of working alongside the populace, engaging them, the emergency funds that we could authorize. In fact, one of the sheikhs I made as a general contractor, he didn't know anything about construction, but his family had been in charge of that region for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the money was being transferred for the projects that we oversaw. You nailed it at that assessment. And that's something that continues beyond Iraq. And
well, I was very fortunate to have observed a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign during a summer tour down in U.S. Southern Command. This was in El Salvador. There was also one going on in Colombia at the time in Southern Command. I was the United Nations Force Chief of Operations, the U3, not dual-hatted as an American officer, but strictly a Blue Beret in Haiti. I was the first Chief of Ops for that force. I spent a year in Bosnia as a one-star general, as the stabilization force, again, Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations, also dual-hatted in that case as the Deputy Commander of a clandestine U.S. Joint Task Force doing the war criminal hunt with special mission units, and then we did counterterrorism operations as well. So all of these, when you put them together, especially Bosnia, because it had a very comprehensive, essentially, civil military counterinsurgency campaign, albeit with virtually little or to no violence. There were occasionally riots or demonstrations, and we're certainly the war criminal hunt and the counterterrorism had some moments of high adventure. But by and large, I don't recall anybody being killed during that year. And nonetheless, the comprehensive nature of that campaign plan was something on which we drew, again, a couple of years later when I was privileged to command the 101st Airborne Division, and they had us air assault north to Mosul to get that very, very out of control city and province of Nainawa under control in the wake of the toppling of the regime in the invasion of Iraq. And we took that plan, noting that, of course, it had all kinds of international organizations helping. You had the United Nations doing, I think it was the police training. You had another organization doing the judicial training. Another one was doing governance. Another was doing anti-corruption and other aspects of that. Here we had to do it all ourselves, but that was fine. We could do that. We had enormous capability. And engineers, by the way, were among those. We did extraordinary work with the engineer brigade headquarters and the other engineer units that we were privileged to have. And some of that is very enduring. We actually scratched out, if you will, what is now Erbil International Airport, and did a lot of work in Suleimania International Airport as well, in addition to repairing the 3 major air bases that we had within Nainawa province. Having seen the damage that we can do to those air bases with the bombs that the U.S. Air Force used in the early hours of the invasion that rendered those airfields unusable until we fixed them. I learned a lot, by the way, about the density of airfield concrete. It's not all that simple. There's a lot more to it, as I learned, than just sort of mixing up some concrete and pouring it into a hole. But again, the idea was to convince the Iraqis that their future would be brighter if they supported us and then their new government, their new country, rather than supporting what was emerging as insurgents and then extremists, and in other parts of the country, Iranian-supported militia. In fact, another sign we had on the wall was, what have you done for the Iraqi people today? And the idea was to partner with them. We had the first government in Iraq at the time. I think it was in 5 May or something. We ran a caucus that I'd spent the first 2 weeks nonstop in Mosul, meeting with every single group, every representative of every civil society entity and element, and then mapping out what we felt would be a representative provincial council. In other words, how many of this and that and the other segments in society, in addition to one from every district within the province. But this included the major tribal entities. It included the major religious and sectarian groupings, the major business elements, the university, even the retired generals had a representative. So the idea was to have a provincial council that would be as representative as was possible of all of the elements of Nainawa province, which was arguably the most diverse in all of Iraq. It's through which many of the ethnic, sectarian, and tribal fault lines of the Middle East run, not just of Iraq. So you have Arabs and Kurds, you have Sunni and Shia and Turkmen and Yazidis and Shabak and Christians of different faiths, different types of Kurds, and on and on. And so you had to get all of that right. And then what we wanted to do was to get a governor who would be respected by all, with whom I could then work, so that when I had a problem, he had a problem as well. And that proved to be very, very helpful. And then in the wake of the de-Baathification without reconciliation order that was signed by the Coalition Provisional Authority head, I was given special dispensation by him, a special exception to run reconciliation processes. And we reconciled thousands and thousands of Iraqis. In other words, getting them back to where they have a stake in the success of the new Iraq instead of a stake in its failure, to give them hope for the future, all of them having been cast out of their government positions or the military or what have you. And in Iraq, that meant that there was no future whatsoever, because as you'll recall, there was no real free enterprise of any significant size other than a handful of people selling sodas out of a garage or something like that. Every other entity was a level or two behind. You could find government ownership. So it was crucial that we did that. We pioneered it. It was why the situation in Mosul and northern Iraq was so much better than the rest of Iraq for the bulk of the first year, until tragically the head of the de-Baathification Commission in Baghdad, a Shia, and of course most of ours were Sunni, that were reconciled. He refused to approve the recommendations that I made to the commission, and then it began to unravel up there as it had in other places as well.
Yes, I remember that very vividly, because hope that it was going to hold and take. And again, I was primarily in the Shia region. The the economy, and you touched on that, and I know you touched on that quite a bit. From many of the aspects of the surge was getting them stabilized, having them get in there, getting into their markets, soccer games by the children playing. We do that in wonderfully after World War II with the Marshall Plan, where you stabilize in the Middle East specifically, because it's such a complex, well, all the sections of the world are complex, but are we on the path towards a successful, I'll call it a Petraeus plan, if you don't mind, sir, a Marshall Plan concept? What do we need to do in that region to help empower, support, get their economies going, stabilization? Are we on the path of that? Are we as a nation? Are we as a global entity, or where are we missing the mark? Where can we go in and maybe, this is a wishful thought maybe, but what could we do better to try to help stabilize that region of the world?
I actually think we're doing a pretty good job. Again, we've had fits and starts. We've learned some lessons the hard way. We have overdone it at times. We have underdone it at times. I think we have a reasonable approach right now. I'd have to sort of walk you around each country as individual and different. Some of them we just can't operate. I mean, there's nothing that we can do for Iran as long as it remains the absolutely recalcitrant, abusive, authoritarian, highly sectarian regime that it is, with near weapons grade uranium enriched at this point in time. But in each case, it is different. In some cases, of course, the countries are doing a magnificent job of their own. I mean, look at the United Arab Emirates, for example. Qatar, I would submit. Saudi Arabia now is into a major modernization. Yes, each one of those has, again, shortcomings from our perspective when it comes to a variety of different issues involving democracy and representation and so forth. But again, also their systems do have certain forms of representation, et cetera. And then you look at a country like Iraq, which has had real ups and downs. In the wake of the surge, with violence down by some 85%, they had a tremendous new opportunity. They did well with it for a good 3.5 years after that. And tragically, right after our final 4-star commander, General Austin, now our Secretary of Defense, and final combat troops left, the Prime Minister unhinged it all by pursuing highly sectarian actions to shore up his Shia Arab base in advance of parliamentary elections, and basically undid an awful lot of what we had sacrificed so much to do together. Then his forces took their eye off the Islamic State, which was able to reconstitute. Eventually, we had to go back in there to help the Iraqis combat the Islamic State, ensure they couldn't take down Baghdad, and eventually did defeat and destroy, actually, the ISIS caliphate, both in northern Iraq and in northeastern Syria. And with the Iraqis and then our Syrian partners doing the fighting on the front lines by and large, with us again providing advice, assistance, and enablers. The enablers, of course, being intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, drones, and other manned ISR platforms, some of which had precision munitions, other precision munitions from close air support, and a variety of other enablers that we provided to them, in some cases, artillery and so forth. Now Iraq, actually, touch wood, I just met with the new prime minister at the Munich Security Conference a month or so ago. I was quite heartened. The fact that he had publicly requested U.S. forces to stay, despite the push by the Iranian-supported Shia militia and Iran itself to get rid of the Americans. I thought that was quite courageous. It's also the right thing to do because we provide still quite significant enablers and support to the Iraqi security forces. And he seems to truly be intent on trying to improve the basic services provided to his people. In other words, he's embarked on what should be the focus of a leader. This is the land of the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and yet they don't have reliable drinking water for all of the communities in Iraq. It's an energy superpower, and yet they can't keep the lights on 24 hours a day. He is determined to remedy those shortcomings, also to improve the quality of governance, which is generally distinguished by enormous bureaucracy, corruption, and political nepotism. So he's taking these on. We'll see if he can succeed where his predecessors have generally not. But I was quite heartened by that. And so everything, or an awful lot in life, comes down to great strategic leadership, really just great leadership, period, but especially at the top of an organization, of a country. And a strategic leader has to get 4 tasks right. He or she has to get the big ideas right, the overarching strategy, has to communicate them effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, the country, whatever, and all the other stakeholders, has to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's what we normally think of as leadership. And then has to formally, in my view, sit down to determine how to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. We had this intellectual framework in mind when I was privileged to command the surge in Iraq. It actually started when I was at Fort Leavenworth because we controlled these different elements to a considerable degree for the U.S. Army. The big ideas are the doctrine. Communicating is how, training, education, all the other tasks we oversaw for the institutional army, overseeing the implementation, how you actually did, again, implement those, and then the constant refinement, Center for Army Lessons Learned, Center for Leadership, all these others. So we used that explicitly during the surge in Iraq, keeping in mind that the surge that mattered most was not the extra 25 to 30,000 American men and women in uniform, as important as they were. It was really the change in ideas. It was the surge of ideas, which were 180 degrees different from what we'd been doing before. We had been handing off security tasks to Iraqi security forces and consolidating on big bases, leaving the neighborhoods and preparing to draw down. Unfortunately, in a year or so before the surge began, there was a terrible event, a bombing of a Shia shrine in a Sunni-controlled area north of Baghdad. And that event in the city of Samarra set off a cycle of sectarian violence that reached terrifying levels. And that's what led President Bush to decide to conduct a surge, to select a new commander and ambassador. And what we did was reverse what we had been doing. You know, you talk about change leadership. It doesn't get any bigger than 180 degrees. So we went back into the neighborhoods, took back control from the Iraqi security forces, cleared and held rather than cleared and handed off, promoted reconciliation because we realized we couldn't kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. We had to reconcile with as many of the rank and file of the insurgent and also militia groups, 103,000 in the end, by the way, and then more relentlessly pursued the irreconcilables, the leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Sunni insurgent groups, and the Iranian-supported Shia militia elements. And did it all with a much even more intensive civil military campaign plan that was signed by not just me, but also by the ambassador, the great Ryan Crocker, the best diplomatic partner any soldier ever had. So that's how we went about that. And again, leadership is what really matters here. And you've got to perform those 4 tasks right. That is the key. And you continually come back to that in any business endeavor, any government endeavor, even a nonprofit endeavor. If you use that particular intellectual framework to look at what it is that needs to be done and then assess how well that is being done, it's a particularly useful device.
Well, there's no question you not only are able to think at the strategic level, but you really get into the details, which feeds that decision making. Moving away from our 20th anniversary of the start of the Operation Iraqi Freedom and looking today, and my understanding is you are publishing, I'm not quite sure if it's published yet, kind of a look at to Ukraine and from 1945 to Ukraine. Just to put a wrap on this today, could you touch on that a little bit? Because I think anybody who watches this, anybody who wants to get a really broad understanding, great understanding of where we're at today, especially from your perspective, this would be a must read because we're watching this daily now of what's happening. 30 years ago, I studied in Poland in Kraków at Jagiellonian University. It's so frustrating to see what's happening there. But will this new book touch on that and give us a look to the future?
Yeah. So this is a book with Andrew Roberts, who's a great British historian and biographer. He came up with the idea and pitched it to me. I felt very privileged to engage in it with him. We divvied up the writing responsibilities for different chapters. Needless to say, I did the first draft of Iraq, Afghanistan, and also Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation when I was in grad school. And then we collaborated and then went back and forth on each of those. And it's titled Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And we walk through all these different types of campaigns. By the way, we continually come back to this intellectual framework for leadership. You know, did the military leaders, did the political leaders, did they understand the nature of the conflict? Did they get the big ideas right? Above and beyond. That's the most important task. If you don't get that right, I don't care how good a communicator you are, how inspirational and a leader you are, the enterprise is not going to succeed. And frankly, that was the case in Vietnam. It took us far too long to recognize that we needed, again, a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign instead of a search and destroy with big units thrashing around in the jungle. That doesn't mean we didn't need to do some of that, but that the priority should have been on security of the people where they lived, predominantly, by the way, along the coast, which is where some 80% or more of them did live. Make the enemy come to you. Now, interesting that the Marines did get it right with something called civic action in the north, but a fairly modest number. And yet it wasn't until General Abrams took over in 1968 that you finally had the kind of approach, the right big ideas. And even then it took another year or more and was never truly completely operationalized because by then we were drawing down Vietnamization and the rest of that. But we squandered, over a decade of substantial involvement in Vietnam before we reached that point. And did not make progress as a result in the way that we might have. There were still enormous challenges with that war. Again, the terrain, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the access that North Vietnam had to South Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, the imperfection, to put it mildly, of our host nation partners, particularly at the political level. Again, just innumerable issues that made that unbelievably more difficult than really any other conflict, including Afghanistan, which had a host of real challenges as well. I remember telling Secretary Rumsfeld, for example, after doing an assessment there, after my 3-star tour in Iraq, that Afghanistan was going to be the longest of the long wars, even though its level of violence at that time was still very modest compared with that in Iraq. But fast forward to Ukraine, I think the big takeaway, without getting into tell me how this ends, which was that question that I uttered out loud during the fight to Baghdad and was quoted ever after by my embedded reporter and those who then read his book. Yeah, there you go.
There it is. Great book.
And then there was a book titled Tell Me How This Ends later on. And we did tell him how it ended because the surge did provide an answer for that, at least for a good 3.5 years. But when it comes to Ukraine, Ukraine is not the future of warfare. It is really what the Cold War would have been had it turned hot, say, in the late 1980s. Most of the tanks, most of the infantry fighting vehicles until now you're seeing Western tanks being provided to Ukraine. Most of those systems were around. Yes, there's some that are a bit more advanced, but by and large, the elements of the future of warfare, which we want to deter, obviously, the future of conflict, those would be very, very different. They wouldn't just have modest capability drones. They wouldn't have short range or medium range precision munitions. You would be able to see everything in a theater. And as the old NATO adage used to go, if it can be seen, it can be hit. If it can be hit, it can be killed. The truth is, back in the Cold War days, and I was there as a major in Germany in the mid to late 1980s, we couldn't actually see all that well. We certainly didn't have drones or great intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets in those days. Even if we did, we couldn't hit it all that well. The precision munitions were very, very limited at best, and particularly if it came to something that was moving. And therefore, you weren't going to kill all that much. So again, you were mostly, despite our efforts to fight through the depth of the battlefield with air-land battle and all the rest of that, you were still going to fight roughly the way you see the fighting going on in Ukraine. A future conflict, on the other hand, and that's the final chapter in that book, that is one where you can see everything, certainly if it's above, on the surface or above, and it will extend into outer space and cyberspace. But what we will see in the future is a much larger number of smaller unmanned platforms, some of which will be remotely piloted, others of which will be algorithmically piloted, instead of what we presently have, which is a small number of very large, incredibly expensive, incredibly capable, heavily manned platforms, such as aircraft carriers and other major combatants. So this transformation is ongoing, in particular, of course, in the Indo-Pacific theater. The pacing threat, as our Secretary of Defense likes to term it, is China. And so we should be very careful not to extrapolate from Ukraine, where you do see glimmers of what the future of warfare might be, but just, again, glimpses, just hints of it, other than the one revolution that we see, which is the presence of smartphones, internet access, and social media, which gives a degree of transparency that you've never seen in a war before. But it's been a wonderful intellectual exercise to do this with a brilliant historian, Andrew Roberts, now also Lord Roberts of Belgravia. And we'll have a lot of fun, I think, when the book comes out in mid-October, and maybe we can re-engage at that time.
That'd be wonderful. No question, we'll be looking forward to that. And thank you again, General Petraeus, for your time. Very, very generous. Again, looking back 20 years, the theme of our discussion today, we have such an incredible men and women who continue to wear the uniform and serve our great nation. And of course, you are definitely one of those who honorably, respectfully, and thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on Operation Iraqi Freedom 20 years later, sir. Thank you so
No,
much.
look, the privilege is mine here today, but even greater, there is no greater privilege, obviously, than being trusted with command of America's sons and daughters in combat, and to have done that in 2 wars, not just one, was beyond my wildest dreams. I remain exceedingly grateful for that opportunity, those opportunities, but even more so, exceedingly grateful to the great young American men and women in uniform who raised their right hand, took an oath after the 9/11 attacks, knowing that they would be asked to deploy to combat, and they still did it, and they re-enlisted during those conflicts as well. In fact, the largest re-enlistment ceremony in history, we believe, was in Baghdad, July 4th, 2008, when I was privileged to be the re-enlisting officer for 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. Ironically, maybe fittingly, in one of Saddam's old palaces underneath the dome. And the picture of that ended up on the New York Times above the front page, above the fold the next day. It was really an extraordinary moment because these individuals knew that by taking the oath of enlistment, by re-enlisting, they were essentially volunteering to come back for another tour of duty. Because at that time, as you'll recall, we were doing a year, actually, that was 15 months, home for a year and then back out. It's really an extraordinary moment. And as I thought about it, I realized how important it is for individuals to feel that they're serving a mission larger than self, how privileged they feel to be doing it with others who feel the same way, and to be doing it at a time when Americans really respected their service, even if they disagreed with the policies that we were implementing at the time. So it was an extraordinary moment. You and I were privileged to be part of something very special along the way, as were each of them. And again, I remain deeply grateful to that generation, which I do believe deserves to be recognized as America's new greatest generation.
Thank you, sir.
Privilege.